But one aspect of it I really haven't gone too in depth on is the history of Jack Ruby, and both pre and post the murder of Oswald. Can you talk to us a little bit about what is known about Jack Ruby and the different reasons he gave for assassinating Oswald in response to this assassination? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So Ruby is the character who, as everyone knows, or most people would know, he shot Oswald before, as Oswald was being transferred. A couple days after the assassination, he is in a room full of policemen in Dallas, and he walks up to them and to Oswald and just shoots him. Now, Ruby was a local nightclub owner, but he was described by a lawyer as being a syndicate lieutenant. And that lawyer also said that he had back in 19 or was it, yeah, I think in 1950, right? That Ruby had testified to the Kefauver committee about the syndicate, and he gave some information about Chicago figures, reportedly, so that they would not investigate Dallas too much, where Ruby was. So Ruby was a syndicate figure, and it's difficult to explain exactly what his role was, except that he was connected to a number of events in the history of organized crime and the U.S. government that were really important. In 1939, he was in the room when this murder happened of the president of a junk handlers union. And this murder was written about later in RFK's book, The Enemy Within, as being pivotal for the Teamster, the mob essentially taking control of Teamster pension funds, which is a huge scandal of the U.S. and a part of organized crime history. These Teamster loans from the pension fund were huge, and they could be given to people for all sorts of political favors for the mob, or they could just be bad loans that would go bad, and it wouldn't matter because the Teamsters pension fund was so huge. So he's connected to that, and he was not, or he was originally arrested, but then nothing comes of it. He seems to have been an informant of some kind. And then in 1946, there's this murder of James Reagan, who was the wire service king. He owned the wire service that went out to all the cities and allowed people to get updates on the racing results and so on. And it was a means of corrupting local police departments, and essentially making them more mobbed up than they would have been, because you get people to take bribes for the wire service and gambling related things, then you kind of own them for everything. You can, once you have that corruption in place, it just is a kind of cancer, and it co-ops the law enforcement in different cities, and that was done all across the country. So, and Ruby was connected to the guys that killed James Reagan, and Reagan told people that he went to Hoover to try to explain to him how these Chicago guys were out to kill him, because that's where Ruby came from originally. And he eventually, this reporter who was a friend of Reagan named Drew Pearson, really famous reporter back in the day, he wrote that after talking to Hoover, he learned that the Reagan thing tracked up to people in very high places, people like Henry Crown and Walter Annenberg, the guy who owned TV Guide and then the Racing Wire later. I mean, and he owned the Philadelphia Inquirer. I mean, basically oligarchs, are who we're talking about here. And so Jack Ruby is connected to this. He's also connected to this guy, Paul Roland Jones, who gets arrested for different drug, violations. But Ruby seems to be an informant in this way. That's one way to explain why Ruby is never charged for these things. They seem to find ways to get him out of these sort of damning circumstances. So Ruby seems to be a guy who is at the nexus of mafia and law enforcement corruption. And there was one file, I think it was an FBI file, where an informant, or a Federal Bureau of Narcotics file, an informant said that out in LA, when some people were talking about doing a drug deal and they wanted to get into Dallas or pass through Dallas, that the person they had to consult was Jack Ruby. He was going to give the go-ahead. So he was connected to the drug trade, and he was connected to police corruption, law enforcement corruption, and to the syndicate, the national crime syndicate that emerged, the Luciano Lansky Teamster syndicate that is still controversial today as to what it really represented. I'm of the mind that it was really a Lansky Teamster kind of a thing, and that the Italian mafia, and they ran the accounting, they set up the casinos in Havana and Vegas to launder all the money, and that they were really the more powerful force, and that the Italian mafia kind of took the more public-facing role, and they, in a sense, in that they ran the drugs in different places and handled the drug distribution at the retail level, and that something of a mythology has been created about this, that it's this Italian thing, when really I think Lansky and the Teamsters were the more key actors, and Ruby was a big part of that. And so what happens with killing Ruby, or with using Ruby as the person to silence Oswald, it's not that, oh, Ruby is, you just can't figure out who he belongs to. It's that Ruby, the people like the FBI and at the top of the FBI, the top of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and James Angleton and the CIA, they've all been protecting Lansky and the national drug traffic. I mean, this is the relationship between the top drug traffickers and the intelligence agencies is extensive and really mind-blowing. And it ends up being, the money gets laundered, it gets folded into so-called legitimate businesses. And this has been a big part of American capitalism, and is probably a part of why we are so corrupt and lawless to the present day, and why you have all these crimes that are so terrible and they never get resolved, like Epstein, for example, recently. I mean, this was an era in which corruption and criminality and sort of mafia capitalism symbiosis gets established, along with imperialism and militarism, because a lot of these guys are invested in military, production as well, and Vietnam is a huge boon to them. Ruby is probably one of the easiest keys, if you can wade through the sort of complexity of it, to see that this was a huge cover-up, and that Ruby is one of the most radioactive, explosive figures if you were to really investigate him, and that's why they couldn't allow it to be investigated. It was a sort of ballsy move for the plotters to use Ruby in this way, but it's not that he's not suspicious. He's so suspicious that he points to corruption that the public could not possibly have been expecting, and that people in high places, they could have just said simply, this would be so damaging if this were actually investigated to the Cold War and the war for freedom and the war against the global communist conspiracy, that we have to cover it up for that reason. I mean, this is the corruption around this whole case exposes is so enormous that you when you start to grasp it, you understand why it's been covered up the way that it is, because this country is essentially, a mobbed up capitalist empire. I mean, you start to really think, like, is there much difference between organized crime and capitalism in the first place? And
hey, detoxers, we hope you enjoyed that clip. If you want to check out more, you can find full episodes and other clips on YouTube, as well as on all the major podcast platforms, and of course, by subscribing on Substack at nolanhigdon.substack.com. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. It really helps us out, and it keeps those tech overlords happy. See you next time. Detox complete.